Okay, any other questions? Logistics? Awesome. So with that, okay, here's our framework again. So you see that we've sort of gone, past the conceptual, we're now in the e-applications. You will see a lot too that within the e-applications, we are only talking about the apps per se, right? And I think I've mentioned before, at some point, if you are interested in ICTD, it will be good for you to take some kind of a broad overview, computer science-y type of introduction class if you don't have that background. And the iSchool has a good course like that. I think Eric's 202, right? Is that the 206, 205, 206? Yeah. Something along those lines, because you'll see, especially if you read the proposal for the eHealth project for today, the description of the eHealth project, you'll know that those are the things you'll be overseeing. So you need some kind of a technical knowledge to either push back to your developers or to your program managers. So, yeah.
I feel that we would be implementing ourselves. We would just, you said overseeing, but I guess, do we ever need to be coding ourselves?
Generally, no, but it depends on the direction you want to go, And for most of us that don't come from a CS background, I think that the career path we end up in is usually more of a project management or a research or policy type of role that would require us to speak with the programmers, and you'll be evaluating technical. For example, you might be running a program. And then there will be an ICT component. And honestly, with the way that technology is being integrated, even if we didn't take this class and we're not doing ICTD, at some point you will be faced with that. Somebody needs a website, and you might need to get bids from vendors, and there'll be 3 vendors, and you need to be able to choose which one. So at some point you need at least enough technical knowledge to go, well, let me at least call my database friend and see what he thinks. Just enough of that broad knowledge, and also trends that might be more, as a program manager, trends probably would be more important than the actual coding in itself. Yeah. Any other questions on the framework? So yeah, we're moving down, and what I have done is push back everything by 1 week. So you'll see that right now we will be starting the project management right after the break, which is sort of a more logical spacing. Okay, so a review of last class. For those of you who were or were not here, you remember that, don't worry about this slide, I did it when Jenna was speaking, but essentially she was critiquing the method in ICT for agriculture that the Jensen article was. And the findings, what she basically is saying is that, it's even in academia, it's very similar to practice, where there's a skew, right? What she calls a skew of disciplinary research. So there's all those debates that are going on. And in this situation, she was critiquing the issue of how Jensen was, studying the impact of cellular phones on these fishermen. So she, came up with really interesting and a really interesting ethnographic study of it. And basically says, Jensen's work is very neat, very nice, very, using very sophisticated economic metrics. And then she comes in from the softer social science background and says, well, it's kind of more messy than it is. So when she had her researchers go into the field, she found that there were some of the players that were not some of the actors that were not taken into consideration. The users of technology was not as simple as he had asserted. The context was really important. She made a distinction between North Kerala, South Kerala, etc. And also the simple, we talked about this, the simple link between increase in income and welfare, right? And so she was also challenging that. So I think some of you came up and also said, well, okay, that's fine and well about academia, but, what are we going to do with that in practice? And the truth is that if you think about what are the trends, throughout class that we've learned, even in what we've done in theory, what is international development, what is ICT for D, and then, what is ICT in agriculture, and even today, what is ICT in eHealth, you'll find that the same old lessons learned are all kind of the same, right? Be cognizant of the debates, know your local context, don't come from a tech angle and just generalize it all over the world. Certainly don't start with the technology, start with the needs of the society. And it's the same old foundational factors in design and implementation, and these are the things that we will also learn within the project management component of our class. And to know that it's usually, messy, dynamic, always changing, and just be very cognizant of being able to revise your program anytime. I mean, sometimes you're implementing a program and really an act of God happens, like the tsunami in Sri Lanka, that really disrupted a ton of our projects. Or, there's a civil strife and the government changes. So that's sort of how the practice role is. It's very hard to put things very neatly. Okay, so with that, let's go into ICT and education theories, right? Hopefully you read the papers. So tell me a little bit about education theories and how ICT falls in. What is she asserting?
That the ICTD educational tools would follow whatever educational method was initially placed. Like she talked about the method of the West, which took the colonial approach.
Right. So I think the tools, right, follows the method.
Yeah.
Right? And the method is sort of following some kind of a theory. Right, that follows from some kind of a development theory, right? She went through this, remember when we did all that spectrum of, I always say this is my favorite analog framework. The one that went from the predominant, the dominant theories, although right now we're seeing a little bit less of this, the dominant theories of development. And then there is the alternative theories, right, of development. And so what is she saying about how education falls into these groups in more detail? Jeff, I'm sorry, did you put up your hand, Jeff?
Well, she's saying that a lot of, at least at the beginning of ICTD, there's a lot of following of the idea that the West is developed and developed is good. So that means the West must be good.
Right.
So that means what we should be doing through all of our educational outreach programs, including e-learning, is figure out a way to make these developing areas more Western.
Right. And where did she get this from, right? It seems to me that what she's also saying, this is absolutely right, is that this Western concept comes very much from these prominent theories, the neoliberalism, the market forces, etc. All the same things that we talked about when we talked about development theories. So if that is, in fact, the development theory that one adopts, right? What is the method? So the method is become the West. Right? And so what are some of the ICTD tools or methods that she's talking about? Or some possible things that might look like? So this is the prominent theories of dominant.
Talking about which recommends the education for all outreach.
Yeah, okay, so become the West, right? So she came up with some frameworks, right? I mean, if you look at the way that she's looking at it is basically saying, well, okay, if you have some prominent and dominant, if you follow this Western theory and your education method is become the West, then obviously the role, right, the role of ICTD is to promote this. So what are some of the ways that, or some of the tools that it might do that?
I think she was talking about localization of content.
Right.
Globalization.
Awesome. Localization of content. So basically, you take a textbook from the Western world, and then you plonk it into country X, and then you replace, United States of America with country X, right? You replace potatoes with matukes. That's one example that she was talking about. Anything else? What might it look like, Krista?
I'm not sure which category this falls into, but the idea that one of the main goals is preparing the skills that the Western world wants you to have. So the skills that are valuable for becoming a part in the global economy. Right.
So become the West, global economy, right? These are very much the same terms you hear when you talk about, all these liberalism, neoliberalism, good governance, global economy, it's open markets, etc., right? So yeah, so basically, if you move this over into the role of ICTD, if your belief in the education is based on this kind of dominant theory, and one of the methods is opening up. So you might look at opening up economies, right, via ICTs. So in this method, global eBay is awesome. Eric?
So copying the pedagogical approaches that seem to have led to success in the West. She was talking about the Prairie and Dewey models where the local community constructs their own knowledge, and so ICTs can therefore as a way to facilitate information exchange and to reach out to more people, they can communicate with each other and have access to information that they create in order to.
Right. So that's kind of the alternative paradigm, right? That she's proposing. Am I correct?
Yeah, I like that one.
Right. So basically, the way that I'm seeing it is that even though she's saying Western as sort of a starting point, the way that I'm reading the article, and I might be wrong, is that she's basically looking at the same old things, the same old theories, right? That we talked about when we talked about theories of development. And she's saying, well, these are the ones that are kind of Western. So if we subscribe to neoliberalism, what would that look like? You could break this down like the way we did during our project, during our class exercise, right? To say, well, if we wanted to do this, then what would be the kind of belief system that we have, and then how would we design it? And actually, you will do this in every sector. We didn't go through this with ICT for agriculture, but that's sort of the thinking of any tool that you see in project design. So yeah, what are some of the alternative theories, right? So she's saying, okay, it's about local knowledge creation, right? So a tool would be, networks, right? Sharing of information. Maybe even creating your own indigenous, keeping your traditional knowledge in a repository. Right? Anything else? So you can see that this is a very simple paradigm. I'm pretty sure that if you really go into education theories and then you mix that with development theories and then you mix it with ICTD, that would make for another really fun, or not fun, PhD thesis. And anything else to add? What is she saying? Krista?
I was going to add not just local knowledge creation, but basically learning technique creation. The idea that instead of having to follow a model created in a different area that might be memorization based or something that.
Right. It's even aside from knowledge, techniques, pedagogies, right? That are relevant. Pedagogies. Because a lot of a lot of the times in traditional methods, word of mouth might be the way of traditional education. See?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I wanted to say that she talks about the informal learning as well as the apps that I guess the community would develop for themselves, whatever would help them learn.
Right. Right, will develop, right? And then this brings you back to the heats innovation model, right? The para-poor, and then this is the the poor, the developing country creating the technology for themselves. Yeah, and so how is this? The thing about it is that as you step back, right, and you think about your own different sectors of interest. And you think about all these sectors that we're studying, once again, it falls back into this mishmash of confusing development theories and then possible confusing debates within the sector itself, be it ICT or health or whatever, and then trying to slap in the ICTD component. So you'll probably find that it's all over the place, simply because it's such a new field. Okay, anything else to add? And then we can go into the World Bank article.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, how can you is it a good idea to sort of put this in black and white? Like, for example, if you say ICT in agriculture, there are so many good practices that farmers in the West practice, which could also fall into the second theory of trying to be more aware of your social context and trying to understand the best practices in agriculture locally. But at the same time, there are best practices from
local
that you can learn from the Western, the farmers
from the Western.
So there could be a hybrid.
Well, the hybrid model is also one of the things that's being touted, right? I mean, remember this is a spectrum. It's not think about the 51 levels of gender. You know what I'm talking about, right? Facebook now has 51 gender categories. You don't know that? It used to be male, female. Right now, there's 51. Questioning. I don't know. And so as we go about in this world, you realize there's a spectrum. It's not necessarily just this is one theory, this is another. You're right. So somewhere at this point, you remember when we were talking, where do they fall in, right? Robert Chambers might be more of the alternative. Easterly might fall back into a little bit like this. So yeah, the hybrid model is something that's also being touted. Yeah, okay. Anything else to add?
So I think it's really actually covered up there already, but one of the things I found most interesting about it wasn't just the knowledge and skills of the West, it was the values of the West that are imported through these techniques and the use of alternative methods to break down that.
Right. So this one is the values, right? So you can see that this also has a little bit of the alternate, the Marxist, the anti, the dependency theory type of rebellion going on, even within the education field. So yeah, the values, and so local value system, right? Resisting the West, right? And so your ICT solutions might look like. Just an example. What if you were designing something and you said, well, that's what I want. What would the role of technology be? Right? I guess, maybe I've answered my own question. Coming back to all these things. Right? Preserving the traditional knowledge, etc., etc. Okay, so if the thing I want to sorry, go ahead, Christina.
The question, so I actually accidentally I read the wrong pages because I didn't see specified. So I read the abstract and some of the beginning pages, and so can you tell me how this relates to her thesis?
You read the whole thesis?
No, I just read the abstract.
Wow. Yeah, I was trying to pick up.
She said it was 5 pages that we had to read, so I just, whatever. But she talks about M-learning and how that's useful in the developing country context. So how does she make because I didn't read these pages, so how does she make that connection? Well, you know, that M-learning is a really Western model.
Yeah, okay, so basically this part is a really, really small part of the thesis. You know, when I read, it's interesting to me. I mean, I've not really done a PhD, so when I looked at the flow, I wasn't really quite understanding how actually this development, the theories just kind of was moved in. But the gist of her thesis was evaluating these 2 distance learning projects, you know, in Bangladesh, I think. And so I think in the context of the M-learning side of things, it's part of a trendy thing of saying, you know, M-learning is sort of a tool. Because, and this is my guess, right? Because honestly, I did not read her entire thesis. Probably won't. Hopefully not. But my guess is probably that especially if you read the World Bank article, you know, M is now the new big thing, right? So M everything. My guess is that the M is a tool. You know, it's not M that is that mixes with the methods. So if we plunk in this is ICTD, then the M part would be the subcomponent that would be, okay, well, you know, instead of having a web portal that shares information, you know, the next thing you would want to do is localize an app in the local language using a platform that they're already using, like Symbian or whatever, or use SMS to share information, kind of thing. Does that make sense? So that's my guess as to where the M is, and generally that's kind of how the world is moving anyway. You can plunk, you know, you can plunk, okay, a development theory. This, like I said, you know what, if you have one takeaway, this could be anything else, your sector. Right, your sector theories. And this is what Hicks was saying in his big diagram, right? The development theories mixed with your sector theories, that gives already a really messy field. Because you're trying to combine both. And then on top of that, you're trying to move it, you're trying to plonk yet another component onto it that's a really new field. You know, and all these are new anyway, because development theory is only 50 years old. This part might be the older part, you know, because agriculture studies have been around for a long time. But pushed together is a very new field. Then you combine it with, you know, the actual technology itself, right? And then you see that you can understand how this field becomes so chaotic, because then you have, you know, Web 1.0, 2.0, you know, mobile, right, tablets, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then all these wars are going on, so then it becomes sort of a huge ecosystem. That's going beyond the question, but just, that's my guess. Okay, any other questions or comments on this? You know, and note that, you know, for me, I don't come from an education background, right? I mean, for me, mine is, you know, governance and law. So I can see that, you know, if next week when we actually go to it, we can draw the same diagram, and it would kind of look something like this. You know, it would be about the theories, and then you mix it with the governance and laws, whatever has been debated upon, and then plunk in the ICT messy component, and then it becomes kind of like this. Okay, any last words on this? So, if we were to put this into the context, and if I were to put her sort of right, you see this diagrams that she has, so you know, it's just a simple way of saying, well, okay, here's our analog diagram, right? The traditional development theories, alternate theories. And then these are the development assumptions, which are based on those theories, the educational approaches, and the roles for ICTD. So it's sort of a simpler way that we've done this. Do you get the connections? Right? So what your takeaway is just to, again, know the relationships, particularly to your own sectors. Okay, so with that in mind, tell me a little bit about practice. What is the World Bank person saying? Sorry about this, the cheesy diagram. What is, or at least tell me what's your opinion reading the piece. Eric?
That it didn't seem like there was a cogent understanding of how M does things differently than just what either end is already doing.
Right.
And there wasn't, and therefore there wasn't consideration of like the cost benefit of using mobile devices. And just in general, like, it seemed like they were using adoption as a form of success as opposed to like measuring against global educational like goals, and so that kind of bothered me.
Yeah, well, that's a great point. I mean, that's the impact. But then the first point of what you're saying is that, well, you know, he's saying that a lot of people come into this field not from an education background, and so, you know, we kind of hop on the trend and we say, oh yeah, you know, right now it's M learning, because this is the point of entry that we come in from. But coming from a background, right, there's this whole education side of things, and then from education, there's ICT for the use of education, technology, or maybe we should say technology for education, and then within that, right, there is a e-learning, and then right now there's m-learning. I actually don't think the framework that he's proposing is this easy. He's just basically saying it's just kind of all over the place. And then at some point people are talking about blended learning, right? So what is blended learning? You don't know. Right? So this is all to say, okay, now if we go back into this diagram, you can see that he probably came from this background, and he's saying, look, I've studied, these 10,000 different theories, but these folks that are in practice right now, they come in maybe from, most of the time it's from a computer science background or some kind of a technical background, and then it becomes about, m-learning without really thinking clearly about the entire sector. And this ties into Christina's point, where this m-learning comes in. So instead of thinking of this as part of the whole ecosystem, and m is but one of the new trends right now, the practice world is thinking of m-learning as the whole thing, right? So m-learning is now this big thing here, and then e-learning, might be here, and then the other factors are all forgotten. So that's what I think he's essentially saying. Anything else to add, challenge? And I think that it's, what he is saying is it's kind of a typical thing. I mean, I think it echoes what I say a lot in class, which is that, look, everybody's now talking about, you can leapfrog e-learning through m-learning. Like, what does he mean by that? He's not saying that. He's saying, everybody is saying that. What do you think he means by that, Krista?
You don't need to set up lots of computer labs if instead you can deliver the content directly to people's mobiles. Right.
Yeah, because then you leapfrog the entire infrastructure, which was the term what we used before about leapfrogging the entire landline.
So he talks about a lot of project proposals that
he received. Yeah, that's a great point.
And then one other question I had was, for m-learning, maybe in the alternative theory of education, like the other one, the latter one that we talked about, maybe it would make more sense to have m-learning in that context, but maybe to understand I don't know, it really depends on what sort of education you're delivering. If it's to know more about the West and stuff like that, maybe it would be better to go with e-learning, maybe if it's to understand the context.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, it makes sense that basically it's like, well, let's not just look at any sector, particularly in this education sector that we're talking about now, but let's just not look at it from one small little component and then generalize it to say that that's the trend. What you're saying is, hey, let's look at what are our goals, and then let's find the appropriate tools. And sometimes it might not be mobile. Sometimes it might just be radio, because some people might not even have mobile, right? So why not use radio and TV like before? So that's interesting. Yeah, any other points to add or questions or things like that? Or, any questions about solicited proposals, unsolicited proposals? Do you know the difference between solicited proposals and unsolicited proposals? We will talk more about it when we talk about project life cycle, and when we talk about fundraising. But most of the times you will find that, and I always talk about RFPs, right? So I'm digressing a little bit now to talk a little bit about, because he's sharing something that he's saying is not Wilbank speak. So every time there's a donor, right? It could be okay. So let's just say this is where the funding comes in, the funding organization, right? Most times, maybe about 80% of the time, maybe more, it would be what they are called RFPs, or requests for proposals, right? And so to respond to this, we write a proposal. Some of you are responding to the DIL grant, right? Are you, who is, MVP folks? Yeah. Okay, yeah, so Okay, so that is the general way of getting someone to write a proposal, and this is usually part of the funding organization strategy. It's like, okay, this year we want to do, I don't know, $10 million worth of learning projects or whatever their organization goals is. Now, then 20% of the time, or less than maybe, they have a discretionary pot. And these are the pots of money that are in program managers that are managing, the certain subsectors within the funding organization. And this is and when you do your budgets, this is a yearly budget. And the annual budgets range. Sometimes it's the tax year, sometimes it's the fiscal year, right? But what he's talking about is that this is the part that is for unsolicited. There used to be, actually, it still might be, a bad habit by funding agencies like this. If you were managing a project, you tend to hold on to this, until the very end. And then at some point you're like, oh my God, so I've been so busy with my RFPs that I have not spent my discretionary funding. And then this is the time when they say, okay, they'll call up whoever, just send me whatever proposals you have, and we'll try to fund it. And this is a strategy that sometimes, we in the NGO will do, because we know like USAID and DFID, they have different fiscal years. So USAID's fiscal year ends in the 30th of September. So from July onwards, you start seeing, depending on the mission, sometimes the mission has spent all their money, so they're like, okay, we don't have any more. But a lot of times you see that this is the time where, whoa, there's a flood of discretionary funding going on, and this is where you get your unsolicited proposals. So people just propose any project, not responding to the RFPs, but usually knowing at least what the funding organization wants to do. And then they keep their fingers crossed. Get this? Okay, so that's what he's saying. He's like basically saying, well, I'm getting all these more and more unsolicited proposals, which is, I'm getting unsolicited proposals, which is, I get all the time anyway. But at this point in history, I'm getting like out of this whole part here, most of them are on learning. And they're from people that don't really understand the bigger theories, right, of what we were talking about. So that's what he's saying. Okay, any other questions or comments or, and this is the time to ask, right? This is me standing here going, wow, this is all so practice-oriented, and there's so many things to talk about, but honestly, I don't even know where to start. So let me know where your curiosity is. Or not.
I mean, just in the ICT for education space.
Yeah, anything. And like I said, I don't come from this background. I only know the trends and know enough from some of my friends that are in the sector. But yeah, I will. Anything to add? Because I want to move on to e-health, so I'm trying to wrap up.
So one thing I found particularly interesting was how in the thesis it talked about how there's a really big behavioral change necessary. I think that might have been in the intro material, which I also read a bit of too. And a challenge that I haven't seen really strongly addressed is it's easier to work on behavioral change in an in-person, very interactive, face-to-face situation. In learning being so distant, if there's a need to encourage behavior change for adoption, I don't see where that would come from if it's all so distant.
Yeah, this brings me back to Eric's point too, right? Where he says, well, to begin with, it's a not fine and dandy article about all these proposals that he's getting, and he's having all these critiques about the proposal, but there's no real impact evaluation, right? There's no real looking into, are these really working? Or at least not yet anyway. There probably are studies, just like the PhD students, but there's not a consistent trend of what works and what doesn't. Or maybe probably there are, and it comes back to the same old thing, right? Local context, et cetera, et cetera. And so to Krista's point, changing behavior, it depends. It's weird because just from my own experience, sometimes changing behavior, sometimes ICT solutions lend themselves easier to changing solutions. Let me give you some example. For example, when we were doing, and like I said, I come from the law background, so that's where my knowledge is. But for example, divorce, if you put two parties in a courtroom and they're seeing each other and, they've had a 10-year relationship and they're fighting about money and all that, that just brings up a whole bunch of things that might not be necessary for that kind of arbitration. Whereas we've actually done, when there's virtual courtrooms, a lot of times that becomes easy. I don't know, somebody has actually told me, it's like, it's actually better to fight over text, with my boyfriend or girlfriend. I don't know if you've heard that. It's like, I think a little bit more, or I think a lot more when I write an email than when I see that person. I think that that's one example. Another example that I've also noticed is that with small businesses, for example, they don't necessarily like to face, in business transactions too. And again, I'm giving the example from the behavior change from the point of view of legal. They don't really want to see their adversary in court, and so that lends itself to that. And I also have thought about yet another example. When I was starting to work in international development, and this was before ICTD, I remember that we were working with HIV/AIDS, people with HIV/AIDS in rural Thailand, so there was a lot of stigma surrounding that epidemic. And when we actually went to them in our trucks, so this is a face-to-face interaction, and we have these focus groups, and we try to get people to come, to be supportive. Nobody would come because there's, so much stigma around that they don't even want our truck driving up there. So I can also see that in a situation like that, sometimes technology might play a better role. So it's interesting. I mean, I would love to hear too about education. I don't know enough.
So another example, specifically education, would be worries about female participation or other kind of marginalized groups. In a non-face-to-face situation, you might feel more free to participate more fully. But the thesis puts forward that that there's a desire in a lot of people who have been kind of subject to this colonial education system to passively receive, and it's very difficult to encourage this kind of participatory learning that the M platforms require. So that's, maybe I'm putting too much faith in one thesis, but I can see that as a major challenge. All of a sudden there's these big pitches for learning.
Yeah.
Similar supportive pitches for getting people to participate.
Yeah, and you see the trends. I think Rashida posted the blog post about the MOOCs, and then within the discussion we were talking about how the whole issue with MOOCs is that there is a lack of, so there's a lot of studies on MOOCs, and then the bottom line of a lot of these studies conclude that, a lot of people sign up for these MOOCs, but then they don't complete the course. And the reasons they're cited for that in that evaluation is that they say that there's a lack of that face-to-face participation, especially also with the professors, So that's one hypothesis that supports, that's one example that supports your hypothesis. And so I think it needs more, behavior change by itself, it's a really, really hard thing to do, even without the ICT component. How do you actually change behavior? And different governments would do it in different ways. Like, for example, in Singapore, this would never fly in the US. Think about China, right? Okay, I don't want people having so many kids. So how do I change that behavior? Okay, I'm just going to put a law down and say you can only have one child. Well, that's one way to do it. Right? In Singapore, when we were doing population control in the 1970s, it wasn't as strict as that. Again, if you draw a spectrum, but then there were these campaigns. You would see commercials. That would be so changing. Like, I don't know, it's indoctrinating. Like, you see these happy families with 2 kids. Because they were advocating 2 kids that were, having a lot of money and all that, and then they would, switch over to 3 kids, and then, all these kids are flying around and being messy, and so, it's true. It worked, because in my generation, in my parents' generation, we ended up having 2 kids. Of course, policy-wise, 15 years or 20 years later, they suddenly realized, oops, there's not enough young people to support the old people, the same old problems, and so they started to advocate 3 kids. So, and So that's behavior changing. Okay, how do people do behavior changing in the US? That's probably a totally different cultural value altogether. When I first came to the US, I was like, wow, people talk so much. You know, it's like, oh, behavior changing, we have to like get everybody's buy-in and then we debate and all that. And that's something that I wasn't used to. But I think that it's, so my point being, you know, behavior changing is it by itself is a topic. And then you slap in that ICTD component, right? Then it becomes even more complicated. Yeah, but great point. Okay, anything else before we move on to e-health, m-health? I mean, yeah.
So I'm also wondering, how available is the technology? I mean, what is our target population? Because if we're trying to, would these methods also apply to the bottom 10% of the populations? I mean, do we just give the mobile and the laptops, or is there do they go to the centers? I mean, I'm seeing a gap in terms of we're creating all these great apps and these tools and these channels to get the information out, but do people have access to this?
Yeah, I think that there is, you know, I think that the hype came out because of, you know, all these indicators and studies that the World Bank have done about, you know, internet penetration versus mobile penetration, right? And then internet penetration between the different income groups versus mobile penetration. And so the hype came up because the statistics are showing that mobile has very steadily been overtaking internet penetration. So from there came a lot of the mobile hype. You know, so, but you're right, it goes back to this whole same whole old lessons learned. And you know, you are asking, right, well, how projects work, what projects work and what projects don't, and why is there forever pilot syndrome? It's all because of all these things. You know, be cognizant of the local context and really be targeted in your target area, and sometimes it might be totally different than a different area that you might be doing. So just to give you an example, when we were doing an education project of sorts in Nepal, there were certain segments that had mobile phones. There were certain segments, especially in Kathmandu, that had very good internet access because...
When you say mobile phones, are we talking...
feature phones or...
smartphones or the old...
Well, when I was working, you know, we were talking about good old SMS. But in this day and time, we're talking a lot more about the feature. At least SMS is a given, you know, that people have that. And then you move up one is the WAP system, you know, where you have the slower...
sort of internet.
Yeah, and then right now there's also a lot of hype surrounding the fact that, oh wow, more and more people are getting smartphones because... and particularly in the Nokia or the Android platform, because of the Chinese market. You know, Huawei, I don't know if you know Huawei, the brand, you know, that's being penetrated right now, and you can buy a smartphone for $40. So that's the new hype, right? Like that, so that the trends are moving. So it's not just M, but it's M, smart M, or whatever that you want to call. But when we go back to, you know, what works and what doesn't work, it still comes back to here. So in the Nepal project, in the different target groups, the interventions were different. The educational content was exactly the same. It was about, you know, change of government policies for small businesses. But how do we reach these people was so different in these, you know, 5 different target groups that we were doing. At one point, we were actually doing satellite radio because they had they don't even have community radio because they were so high up in the mountains. So we were actually using satellite radio.
And going off of that, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but...
No, you can't. It's fun.
I remember reading another article about how as we depend more and more on these technologies to gather information and draw a picture of what's actually happening, we risk forgetting about the people who don't use them, the people who don't adopt. So if you don't have a cell phone or a smartphone, then all of a sudden you drop off the radar on the part.
Right. Yeah. Did you need something? Gary? Oops. Did you need something? That's okay.
So I'm going to take it saying that there's a problem with projectors.
That's what?
There's a problem with projectors.
From me?
No.
No
I
problem.
was just checking. They look
Yeah, thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, so just people falling off the radar and risking
being more and more, the digital divide, right? That's what people, yeah, I mean, and in theory, I think that that's true. I mean, I think if you look back at that, the Jensen article, right, what he said was, well, you know, even the smaller fishermen that were not really using the mobile phones, they get the benefits through the spillover. Is that true? Is that not true? I don't know enough. But I think that there's something about the divides. You know, I don't know if you could ever actually get rid of the divides. You can introduce a tool that would bridge these two, but you would then create a divide between the middleman, for example. You know, you're still ousting out your middleman. Is that a good or bad thing? In general, that's seen as good. But if you're with the middleman stakeholder group, you'd say, well, no, that's bad. Right. And that there'll always be someone out. Okay. Any other questions on? Eric?
I had a general question about, have you sensed a tension between like the government or ministries of education with, so it seems like some of these technologies are meant to like accept that, okay, they're bad teachers, they don't have the resources, we're going to bypass that and give you tutoring or like abilities to, you know, increase your skills like outside of the formal education domain. And then there's another approach where like, no, we're going to, you know, provide classrooms with computers or whatever, infrastructure or learning materials for the teacher or whatnot. And so it just seems like there's a tension there where there's an acceptance of the teacher in the formal classrooms by a role to play, and then one that says we've given up on that, we're just going to try to bypass it.
Right. And that's a great observation because it brings us back to, you know, my favorite, you know, male-female 51 levels of distinctions analog diagram, right? Because this is exactly the same argument that higher education is facing right now, I mean, the same types of debates. You know, you see all these online MOOCs and MOOCs, for example, that most of the time don't even use the professors. They're using peer-to-peer learning. There's a lot more of different pedagogies. So there's a whole line of spectrum. And then there are the traditional folks, particularly people in universities. You know, if you talk, especially if we do, with my group that will be doing the online learning project, you see these, you know, very traditional stakeholders that would say, you know, that would never replace us. And will they not? I think only time will tell. But if you think of trends, you know, this is something that Amazon has said, right? You know, like nobody's really going to be happy getting a book online. You really want to touch a book and be able to flip it. And when I was young, I loved smelling books, you know, and I thought, well, there's something about it. But think about it, you know. Now that's also being sort of bypassed. So I guess my answer is I don't know yet, you know, because we're still experimenting the changes, but I wouldn't be surprised, you know, if they do. Now, coming back to implementation and how we do it, I think in good international development, the more conservative donors will require you to work within the education system, within the health system, work with the governments, work with the schools. So therefore, you see a lot more entrenchment within the system, as opposed to, okay, let's work with the entrepreneurs that would actually have these, you know, cool e-learning projects that would bypass everything. Yeah, but that in itself gives a whole host of problems that, you know, if you read the mHealth article, you would see those are the same old implementation problems. Your teachers don't have enough capacity, your classrooms are already having dysfunctional issues. You know, if for example, if you're trying to solve dysfunction with technology, that might amplify the problem eventually. Christina?
I was just going to add that I think it also feeds into the discussion of just public services in general getting privatized, and in developing countries as much as in developed countries. So I think that also has to do with it. This bypass would feed more into the privatization model, which I think is significant.
Yeah, but I mean, the government still has like a role to, I mean, they still get to choose, right? That somehow can match their agenda.
Yeah, I think privatized services have more leeway in deciding a lot of the, like they probably, in the education example, they probably, even private schools would have to, you know, have a certain level of education that they need to meet the set by the government. But I think the tools, and they have a lot of freedom.
True.
Yeah, well, that's depending on the policies themselves. But yeah, in general, maybe yes. You know, some governments, some ministries of education have a lot more restrictions on what's happening there. And then there might be even some that, I mean, in the most extreme places, it's not just about privatization of the local companies and education system. It's about all this free education that's sort of floating out there too, like Khan Academy and all that. So interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, I think maybe it goes like, what results do they want, right? So maybe they don't care how they get there, and so maybe they'd be more lenient on how much freedom they give to the private industry. But then it goes.
And also how much they get in I guess corruption money or election funds, etc. But yeah, aside from all that.
Right, I think it goes down to the outcomes that they want, right? And so it's like and then that's informed by your values, right? You just care about like more people getting jobs or.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption, and I think that. And I come from have been in practice for too long, cynical, right? And I say, well, a lot of times I don't know if it's that pure in intention. A lot of times it's just like, they go to a conference and then they go, oh wow, my neighboring country is doing this, I want to do this too. So, I'm a little jaded, but I would also say that should be the starting point. Yeah. Okay, cool. Should we move on? Okay, M-Health. Okay, or at least e-health. Let's talk about. Okay, let's discuss. The main document I thought was fairly useful as a practice document because it's very pragmatic, very focused, and it tells you, what is it, what works, what does not work. So, what is e-health? And how is the distinction made?
A lot of things combined. It's not just one thing.
Okay, yeah, it's a lot of things combined. And what are those things? Because there's health, right? Because there's a lot of things within health, and then again we slap in the E, right, or whatever, or the M, or So again, it depends on the definition, right, of what the sector has defined health.
Okay, so in E, parts of health, there's one that they talk about is the health records, logging,
Right.
electronic
Health records, right, and processes. So there's a whole bunch of things that they have here, telemedicine, etc., right? And even one level up, and this is me not coming from a health background, but what it seems to me that he's saying is that, when we say, e-health or even health, a lot of us assume it is healthcare. Right? It's about what we assume is health is healthcare. Pharmaceuticals, drugs, going to a doctor, getting diagnosed, etc., etc. And to my surprise, he says, about the majority, like maybe more than 90% of all types of health projects focus on healthcare or something like that. But that increasingly, there is the 10%. Okay, this is my. I don't know I don't think he put a percentage, but. He did say a small percentage was on things that are not healthcare, right? And what are those things? Anybody remember? What are the other things that might make up health? So healthcare is one of them, out of which health records, the processes, hospital, taking medicine. And then what is the other part of healthcare that the industry, and this is not set in stone, it's only set in stone as far as the health industry is concerned, right? Because we're going back again to the theories and what the industry sees as general practice and definitions.
Which category did the counseling, telecounseling and fall under? Is that?
So the telecounseling, etc., for example, is a tool, I guess, a type of tool, right? And so that could fall under either. But my distinction is he was making a distinction between healthcare and anything not healthcare, And what surprised me was that this was along the lines of preventative care and also public health. Right? So most of us think of health, most of us think of health as, okay, someone is sick, so how do we implement any kind of a solution or ICTD solution to address this, right? Okay, someone needs a surgery. Okay, let's do a telemedicine to see a telemedicine video, live video that would teach, from a Western doctor that would teach a Nepali doctor how to operate on cataracts, for example. Well, that's the kind of healthcare that generally people in the industry or even outside of the industry, like me, would assume that's healthcare. But what he's saying is that there are these other things that are actually becoming bigger than healthcare, i.e. preventative health. Right? You know what preventative health is. You're not sick yet, but there's a lot of education, traditional medicine, etc., and also public health, which is communicable diseases. So that's the distinction he's making. So all this is just to show that this is the equivalent of maybe this part of the health sector, right? So when he's saying, well, okay, there are all these things. So e-health, right, encompasses these few areas, both the e-health in the healthcare side of things, and also the public health and the preventative health, and the other things that are up and coming. Got that? Right? Okay, so what is he talking about, the e-health solutions, right? And this is this figure here. What is he saying? What is he saying in terms of the? Because if you read the part that is missing, he was actually talking about the players and the people that are doing health work, and in particular e-health work. So. But that was not an assigned part of the reading. But what was he saying about, okay, well, how do we implement this pragmatically? Johnny, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I think I remember well, they were talking about so that we can implement this, we need to have ways of objectively evaluating e-health, what are the gains in productivity? Mm-hmm. What about the global trends? And I think one of
yeah, let me look at my notes again. Yeah, I remember something like that too.
And also what are the costs and impacts to the health system? Is it worth it trying to bring in e-health, or we could continue using channel that money into research? Right.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what you're referring to is that, well, he was saying, well, how do people decide, what kind of e-health projects to implement, right? The question is, how do they do that? So the question of what, I think he came up with, well, there are a few ways to think about methods of what, right? So what do we want to evaluate? I mean, not what do we want to implement, or what e-health projects should we do with this particular target group? So he says, well, there are a few ways that you can decide, predominantly three. One is the productivity gains, right? Which again is sort of from the very econ side of things. If I implemented this health record savings, how many man hours will it save me over the longer term? He also talked about, the impact on public health, right? Some people don't really worry about productivity gains, but rather look at, wow, if we spent this amount of money to nip something in the bud that might be communicable. When we talk about public health, a lot of it has to do with communicable diseases. If we nip this in the bud, it would actually save us a whole bunch of headache. And he gave the example of HIV/AIDS. If we had implemented some kind of maybe a component of that, a lot of the results might be lessened. And then he also talked about, well, some people might look at specific technologies and re-evaluate and evaluate that, i.e., looking at the specific technologies and the context. So, i.e., looking at, okay, what is most important to me in terms of a target group or in terms of the types of technology. So that's what he's saying, that how to decide on what to implement. And obviously he's talking about this from a very macro level. So having decided on what is he saying about the how? What is his like 3-prong entry point? Do you remember that? Seema, take a step. You're the only one that's nodding.
I think he talked about, I don't remember exactly what the 3-prong thing was, but he was saying that how you will have like planning, implementation, and deployment. I mean, planning, deploying, evaluating, and then putting the feedback back into the loop after you do your evaluation for all these health schemes.
Right. It's actually really interesting. Yeah, I want to go quickly into that. Okay, so but let me tell you what he's saying. He's saying, well, look at this diagram. This is how I think that generally e-health solutions are introduced to developing countries. Right? Why would a developing country decide to adopt e-health or not? Oftentimes, there are 3 entry points as to why a country would start doing this. One is you go, what he calls access to care, but then it's through the political entry. So you talk to the government and all of a sudden, or in my words, always they go to a conference, they come back and they say, oh yes, I want to do e-health now because my neighbor is doing. So that's from the political side of things. And then the other entry point, why, is that a health professional might be saying, hey, I'm really frustrated with this thing that I'm going around in circles. I think that if I implemented it with some kind of an IT solution, that would be way more effective for me and my patients. That's another point that it could come in. And then the economy of care, he's talking about that's from the donor's perspective, right, or the funders. Somebody comes in and say, hey, I think you should be doing some kind of an e-health thing, and I think you should be starting with whatever, pick a e-procurement or whatever for healthcare projects, because I'm really sick and tired of all these corruption that my money is going to, because procurement is not streamlined. So let's plunk in an IT solution. So that's what he's saying. He's saying, well, that's how a country starts adopting this e-health initiatives.
I have a question about the third group, because you said it was the donors. The way I understood it was that he was talking about just people who are in charge of the economics of healthcare in general.
Mm-hmm.
So even local economists, if you go to them and say, see, this e-health solution
right,
might be cheaper than whatever you're doing right now in the country.
Yeah, and I guess I use donors in a very loose terms, but yes, it could be the Ministry of Finance, it could be proponents of people that are doing the long-term strategic health care and maybe doing some kind of a budgeting, for example. Yeah, so it comes from that angle, but generally my sense is that, you get a lot more clout from a donor's point of view than if, I'm a Minister of Finance. Well, maybe if a Minister of Finance might be okay, but if I'm like somewhere, underneath there and I'm the only component, it's not going to be as loud as if I say, okay, here's a chunk of money, take it and do something with it. Yeah, but good point. Okay, so what are some of the trends that you can read this on your own, because he just talked about some very, very short things. But what I want to really discuss before the end of class is the Forever Pilot pattern. Okay, so how does he describe it? And he describes it so well because you can, while talking about localization of content, right? You could just delete e-health and just substitute it with anything, e-agriculture, e-education, and it would still be the same cycle that he's talking about. But how does he describe that? And that is your forever cycle, forever pilot syndrome. What does it look like? How does it start? How does it end? And that's actually the really interesting part about the article. Remember? It's right at the beginning of lessons learned, right? Where he says, okay, here are the lessons learned. Here is the problem. So he describes the problem and he says, okay, here are the 7 or 8 lessons learned. Tell me a little bit about the problem. And he puts it very clearly in like pump, 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 pump. Here are the 7 things, and this is a cycle, and this is your forever pilot syndrome, that anything, that any e-health project, and like I said, it could be any other project.
Yeah, it seemed like when we talked about, we had a day where we talked about just basic issues of deploying ICTs in the new world. So it was kind of like, okay, we're going to implement this thing based on the medical lens, and then we get there, and there's like device issues, and then we fix those, and then now they're like understanding how to use it in cultural issues.
Right, yeah, exactly. So there are lessons learned, right? So he was like, okay, so there are all these lessons learned, and then he like plunked it into his own language, and we can use our own language. But yeah, so one of the things would be, you come in from a too medical lens, right? And maybe not enough of a local context or whatever. And that's one of the possible lessons learned. The interesting thing is, what about the Forever Pilot? How did he describe it? Right? How does a project start, and then why is it dropped off? In his description of the, and this is the interesting part, because this is your Forever Pilot, and it happens not just with e-health, it happens with your M-health, M-education, E-education. What does it look like?
Well, I guess you generate like fervor and support for a short period of time, get enough funding.
Right, yeah, funding, right? So if I were to plunk in that cycle, okay, so what is the issue with funding? Articulate it again, please.
That it's a short term. And
short-term funding, okay. And expecting miracles most of the time.
Right.
Right? Expecting short-term project and short-term funding with high expectations. Awesome. Okay, so that's one factor, one characteristic of a typical ICTD project that ends up that gives rise to the Forever Pilot syndrome. Krista, you had something to add?
It was basically the same thing. I think the Forever Pilot syndrome is largely because of funding cycles. After just a couple of years, especially considering all of the challenges that these things tend to face at the onset. They're seeing results, but not as much results as they wanted to see. And instead of continuing with that project, they'll start up a new project to look for one that has more miraculous.
Right. So if I could just come up with my own framework, I'll be like, okay, you come in with a narrow lens, right, or a really narrow vision or goals, and your goals is really ambitious, to say eradicate malaria using this website, right? So. Which doesn't happen. And then then you find a donor, and there's a short-term thing. You write a project that says, yes, I'm going to be able to. Okay, I'm exaggerating, but it's along those lines. Okay, with this, I'll eradicate it with this website. And then Krista at a point that says, well, there are all these implementation challenges, right? That are usually outside of the technology. It's not the website that's overloaded or too slow or not user-friendly. It's everything else but. Right? And then what happens after that? You kind of do some kind of a, M&E, and then the results are dismal because you're not meeting the high expectations of the narrow lens and the goals. Right? And then that's when it kind of goes into obscurity, and then another pilot will start because someone would say, okay, fine, they had a problem because they're trying to eradicate 100%, let's just do 75%, and then it's the same old problem all over again. Any thoughts or questions or feedback on this?
I think also overlooking the local context, the risks involved in piloting in local context. Like you assume certain things, but then, for example, there couldn't be like electric supply on a regular basis. You lose electric supply.
Yes, exactly. So first, your first problem is a narrow lens, i.e., wow, this really worked in Africa, in country X, we're going to implement it here. And then at the same time, your implementation challenges comes back to your power, your infrastructure, right? Remember when we talked about the bottom of the pyramid paper and why that didn't work? So you have the same old issues, power, infrastructure, lack of local contacts, right? And then at some point you start feeling like you're a broken record because you're going back to the same old things. Local contacts, you're not really meeting the needs, maybe there's no real need for malaria. In fact, a lot of the times, let's not go into malaria. Okay, sorry, Lawrence?
And so, do we ever see this sort of pattern in the private sector for ICT, in the ICT industry?
In the ICT industry, you mean in the private sector in terms of...
In terms of creating a pilot with high expectations that fail to meet the goals. Why?
Are you talking about like an IT project or an ICTD type project? Because an ICTD type project by the private sector would be like the social enterprise type.
Right. I'm thinking not necessarily the need, just ICT in general.
Okay,
how would the private sector go about
how would that? Well,
solving this? And why isn't it done?
I mean, 98% of the startups fail or whatever.
Yeah, there's a high percentage of startups that fail. Also because of this, right? I mean, everybody jumps on the bandwagon. It's like right now it's big data. I think in the big Silicon Valley, everything is big data. So all the startups are like big data. It's interesting. I mean, I don't know enough to really give you like a concrete answer, but my guess is that they are very much driven by the bottom line. And the bottom line of money. So at some point, right, I mean, they might run through this whole gamut of things, and it might be that, okay, they have a VC that comes in and gives them money, right? But at some point, they would run out of money and then they might end up doing this. So that probably happens too, But like I said, I don't know enough about like Google, for example. Sometimes actually really encourages this. They want your projects to fail so that, out of the 80% that fails, 20% can succeed.
And at least
and that's the innovation model.
They get to lessons learned out of it.
Yeah. Seema, you want to add a point?
Yeah, actually my blog post this week is exactly about this, so I was just smiling through everything.
Oh really? I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, so it's about this man who...
Did you not send it like at 2 o'clock or something?
I just added you as a contributor.
Okay.
So yeah, it's about this man who creates a sanitary pad making machine in rural India, and he's already like deployed 1,300 machines that's changing lives of like so many women. I think the big assumption that is made in all these projects is actually, so I discussed how he's actually implemented the lean startup model without even knowing it, without even being educated. He's not educated at all. And where that changes this whole forever pilot model is assuming, not assuming that the product is needed in the first place,
right,
and asking the question of whether we should build this product rather than how we should build this product.
Right.
So he does the same thing where he's just gone out there, he's just checking if people even need a solution like this, or if it's even like if anybody's even going to use it if he makes one. Whereas most of the projects, even startups in the Silicon Valley and even ICTD for projects, start with the assumption that, okay, we need to build this product. How do we build it?
Right.
So if you start with that assumption, you're already bringing onto yourself a big challenge because you're going to make the product eventually. You just get so much buy-in from all these players, even without having started a project.
Right.
So yeah, that's what I wrote about, but I didn't do it.
That's incredibly interesting. Yeah, I mean, Google does this a lot, much to my sometimes frustration, because they'll do a product and then I'll be like, oh, this is pretty cool, and I'll use it, right? I mean, there's so many things like that they all of a sudden take away, like Google Reader, and they're like, no, there's not enough demand for it at some point. I'm just gonna, stop producing it. So it becomes frustrating because at some point, and for at least for the for-profit company, Lauren, I mean, where you can see the needs is pretty clear. The market will tell you. Whereas for the development world, it's sort of more iffy. How do you really know I'm safe for really going in to do a needs assessment? Okay, but before I end class, I want to actually focus on these lessons learned. We don't have time to go through them, but if you look at these 6 or 7 lessons that they talked about, it's exactly very, very similar to the same old, broken record of, it's just a different spin. They use medical, maybe more medical terms. But it's all about the same old things. Capacity, did not focus on the needs, came up with, started with the technology before, and then, not having enough buy-in with the stakeholders. So it's the same old foundational issues. Most of the time you'll find out, with the forever pilot syndrome, and this might come as a big surprise, most of the time, probably about 99% of the time, it's not because the technology failed. It's not because, the technology wasn't good enough or was not answering. It's everything but. So if there's one thing as a takeaway, take these lessons learned away, right? Because you wanted to learn about the forever pilots and why they failed. So the next 2 lessons we'll be talking about some other sectors, but after spring break we will actually be focusing on each of these things. How do you do a needs assessment so that this is under our project management. How do you actually write a proper proposal? Would you ever respond to a 1-year IFP, or 3 years, or 5, or what? And then how do you implement it and troubleshoot problem? What happens if your proponent gets disappears? And then how do you do monitoring and evaluation so that instead of going this way, you could actually scale up the next phase, right? So that's how our class fit in. Okay, so with that, any last minute questions? Last questions are. Okay, then, so on Wednesday, please come to class, and if at all possible, bring somebody else. I don't know why we have this big classroom. I feel a little embarrassed and intimidated, with when Jenna was here, there was just 2 people here. I was like, oh my gosh, Jenna, But, Bruce is the executive director for Invenio, who does, please visit the website. They do infrastructure and hardware for developing countries. Lots of interesting work that they've done. And they were a startup that actually is fairly successful. I think they started by Kristen, that I forwarded to you, Krista. She started this organization maybe about 7 or 10 years ago, and right now it's sort of pretty robust. So it's a startup that has sort of working on technology and infrastructure, and would be also a good person to network if you're interested in this area and interested to be based in the Bay Area and work overseas. Okay, so thanks. See you Wednesday. Yeah, if possible, bring someone.